All right, we're going to conclude our study in the lyric poetry of George Herbert and some of the collection of his great series of poems called The Temple, with a study of 4 poems. The first one I'll look at is Prayer 1, then we'll look at the Elixir, then at one of his more famous poems, Love 3, and then finally at the Pulley. I'm just going to, without further ado, go straight to the poems, and let me begin by sharing my screen, and I'll read them to you, and then I will make comments. What we're going to see in all of the poems is a compressed language with terrific use of imagery. As we said already several times, Herbert is a metaphysical poet, but the metaphysics that he draws upon are really the relations between a man who's a sinner and God, and the specific relationship which is hidden to the world and yet manifest to the individual, and certainly is fully manifest to God. God sees us, although we don't see him. And in prayer, this particular poem, the first poem I'm looking at, Prayer 1, what we have here is a congeries of images and associations with prayer, some of which are ones that are going to flatter us and some that are going to scandalize us, and nonetheless are often associated with prayer. So we will find that some of the associations with prayer are actually blasphemous. This is hardly surprising, since we're told by Jesus that the Pharisees themselves pray loudly and publicly, and yet he condemns the Pharisees for being false teachers and whitewashed sepulchres. So without further ado, prayer. Now note the form, first of all. It's in the form of a sonnet, and the sonnet is a form of a love poem bequeathed to us by the Italian Renaissance. Francesco Petrarch is the originator of the form. So it's a very modern form in Herbert's mind, Herbert the classicist. Prayer. Prayer, the church's banquet, angels' age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the Almighty, sinner's tower, reversed thunder, Christ's side-piercing spear, the 6 days' world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manna, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. So what we have here, as I say, is a congeries, a heaping of phrases that we associate with prayer, some of which are splendid and memorable and delightful in ways that we would wish to describe prayer in its best sense, but as I say, some of them positively shocking in the way that they are an indictment of the human misuse of prayer. So in these 3 lines here are the absolute reversal of everything good about prayer. Note the form, as I said, it is a sonnet, and it has a specific rhyme scheme here: age and pilgrimage, AA, birth and earth, BB, tower, spear, hour, fear, again, ABAB, CDCD, and then comes the volta, or the turn, towards something rather different, and then it goes EFF, E, and then the rhyming couplet at the end. So something of a combination of the Petrarchan sonnet with its octave and its sestet, with the Shakespearean sonnet with its 3 quatrains, and a rhyming couplet at the end. And the rhyming couplet concludes this as well, and concludes it with rather positive imagery. But first of all, just the associations. The church's banquet. Remember the messianic banquet, in which the new heavens and the new earth is presented as a feast for the bride and the bridegroom. Jesus is often presented at feasts in the Gospels, and prayer is the partaking of the presence of God himself. And so, and all of the riches and blessings and delights there in that notion of a banquet and feeding, for that matter. Angels age to some degree, just simply talking about the longevity of prayer. It's not something finite, it's something that is perennial and is eternal in its scope. It is a form of language that God himself gives to us, in which we can communicate with him, because it's God's breath in man returning to his birth. Much of human language is directed against God, and or at the very least ignoring the presence of God. This is the word of God which made man breathe and live, returning to praise his maker. The soul in paraphrase, very interesting. Hard to define the soul, much language and many books written on Christian anthropology and what the significance of the soul is, what exactly is the essence of the soul. Well, prayer is the soul in paraphrase, Herbert submits here. Or the heart in pilgrimage. Again, this word heart in Hebrew sense, the lev, is the essence of the person. It's not merely the organ beating in our chest. In fact, for Herbert, it's not that at all. It's the essence of the person. It's the desires of the person. And here they're in pilgrimage. They're also the way in which we assess the depths of things. Here it's a plummet, sounding the depths as you sailors would do, seeing how deep things. Well, here it sounds heaven and earth. That's how extensive. We've seen how long it is. Here's how deep it is and how high it is, for that matter. Now the, as I say, rather unsavory associations, the engine against the Almighty. Engine here used in the sense of a war engine, like a cannon. So prayer used to excoriate God, to attack God. A sinner's tower, much like the Tower of Babel here. It's a place where we use something which ought to be used humbly, but rather use it out of pride. So the tower, much like the Tower of Babel. Reversed thunder. So if you think of thunder being associated with Job or with Thor or something of that nature, we'll hear rather the reverse. We are thundering against God. And to that end, Christ side-piercing spear. So rather than returning God's breath to him in blessing as he blesses us, it is crucifying, or in this case, spearing Christ right through his side as the spear did. Then a rather more pleasing association, the 6 ways world transposing in an hour. It might be more pleasing. It also to some degree reflects our ignorance of what prayer does. We put in 1 short hour what God took 6 days to do. It reflects our impatience, perhaps. But then moves on, a kind of tune, but a tune which creates fear and also is heard by all things. So it's talking about the significance of prayer, but the cosmic significance, but also the power of prayer. Softness, he suggests, and peace and joy and love and bliss, common associations these days. Exalted manna, that food which God gave to the people of God in the wilderness. The word manna means literally, what is it, is my understanding. So it's exalted, but who knows exactly what it is? It's gladness of the best, the saints. It's heaven in the ordinary. It's a man well dressed. We put on Christ and his righteousness. We speak the words which God gives us to speak. It's the Milky Way. It's the bird of paradise. Wondrous descriptions. It's church bells beyond the stars heard. It's the soul's blood, very much like the soul in paraphrase, and the heart in pilgrimage. He returns to that metaphor. The land of spices. It's exotic. Although it's ordinary, it's exotic. And finally, the summary phrase, for all of those things which seem to contradict and seem to be beyond our grasp, it's something that God understands. I think that's what's meant here. He's not talking about our understanding of it, but rather it's something that is understood. It's understood by God. He, whenever our hearts condemn us, God is gracious and forgiving because he's greater than our hearts. So prayer, wonderful little poem. Let me move to the Elixir, one of my favorite poems by Herbert. The elixir is some sort of a substance which will give us a sense of immortality. It's a potion and a cure for human ills. And the human ills, of course, can be those which we would define physically, or we could also speak spiritually. And that is the sense that Herbert has in mind here with the elixir. He's talking not about the problem of human mortality, although obviously he is aware of that. He's talking about the thing that leads to mortality, the fact that we die, namely sin. As ever, his eye is theological and keen to attend to the challenges of the human condition. So the elixir is such a potion. Well, how does he present it in this poem? Teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, and what I do in anything to do it as for thee, not rudely as a beast to run into an action, but still to make thee prepossessed and give it his perfection. A man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eyes, or if he pleaseth, through it pass, and then the heaven espy. All may of thee partake, nothing can be so mean, which with his tincture for thy sake will not make bright and clean. A servant with this clause makes drudgery divine, who sweeps a room as for thy laws makes that and the action fine. This is the famous stone that turneth all to gold, for that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told. In the end, the philosopher's stone, the touchstone, the krinos, the way of discernment here. The elixir is not a potion here per se. It's not even a substance. It's not something that we drink. It's an attitude. It's a magical attitude. And what is the attitude in it? It is to see God's righteousness presented to us, which we are to put on. And in light of the fact that we can put on Christ's righteousness, to act out of service for others, knowing that we serve God in so doing. So whoever serves one of these little ones, says Jesus, serves me. So whenever you give drink or food or sustenance or care to somebody who is a human being in need of it, you are doing it in many ways explicitly for Jesus. That's what Jesus himself says. So the elixir here is comprehensive. It's in all things, thee to see. So that we can't see God visibly because his being is invisible. He's a spiritual being. Nonetheless, his presence is omnipresent. He is here, and it ought to motivate our actions. It ought to be the source of our actions. It should be the goal of our actions to be pleasing God. This is the attitude which he evidences in the poem itself. And in action, not rudely, without forethought, but rather with the idea of God's presence in the action itself, but still to make thee prepossessed and give it his perfection. Now, how can we look at this? Well, we can look at it as on a glass, like a mirror. We can look at it and it reflects back upon us. Or, and this is better, to see through the glass darkly and then see God face to face. So he's picking up on that famous passage in 1 Corinthians 13 and using this metaphor of a glass, but speaking now of it in two forms, one that reflects back upon us in which we see ourselves, which is true. When we look at God, we see ourselves, see Christ, we see the image of who we ought to be, but also we can see through that glass to what lies behind the glass of ourselves. We can see God's image in us. And there is no restrictions upon this. It's not a matter of station. It's not a matter of of birth. It's not a matter of age. All may of thee partake. Nothing can be so mean that which with his tincture. Now, a tincture is something in a potion. You put it in a little infusion to add color, to add vitality, whatever. In this case, the tincture is to do it for God's sake, for thy sake. That will make it bright and clean. And that includes all things. It includes vocations. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker are all godly occupations, not just that of the clergy and the priesthood. Divine service is doing anything for thy sake. And he says, and this is splendid, a servant with this clause, that is for thy sake, makes drudgery divine. Who sweeps a room as for thy laws, makes that is the room, and the action fine. So it's not just what we do, it's how it is done and for whose sake it is done. And when we do that, it is the famous stone that turns all to gold. For that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told. Splendid poem. Note that it is entirely orderly and regular in its form. 4 quatrains, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 quatrains with alternating rhyme. Very regular, and yet it comprehends so many different topics here. Just like prayer did, the elixir does here, but unlike prayer, it has a unity, and the unity is in seeing God and his purpose and his and aiming to do God's will in all things. That is the elixir. That is the way of eternal life, which elixirs in ancient mythology were used to affect. But here it is an attitude. It's the action of someone who's been born again. Love 3, famous poem, often cited in Anglican churches. In my experience, here we have love, just to set up the poem, personified. Love being, of course, God. Jesus is the love of God, visibly expressed to us. He's love divine, all loves excelling, as Wesley puts it in his hymn, written after Herbert, of course. But here presented in, as I say, a personified form, and imagining the context of the communion table, where the sacrament of is being presented of bread and wine. So let me read it. Love, and I'll add one final thing. The person coming to the communion table feels himself unworthy to be there because, of course, it commemorates the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ, and the man who is coming to the table is in full awareness of his sin, and his heart is condemning him. So with that said, love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall he be. You shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. So what we have here is a dialogue taking place in the context of these 3 little stanzas. And again, we note the regular rhyme scheme here as well. So the strong structure here, and it's a 3-part play to some degree. And the interaction between Christ who is here being personified in the encounter of a sinner coming to the communion table. And it's as if as the bread and wine were itself speaking. Remember, Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood." Here we have the body and the fleshly Christ speaking and welcoming him, here perhaps in the guise of the priest inviting to the communion table. But he, as the sinner, rejects this because he's conscious of his own sin and does not want to partake of something that he feels he's unworthy of. But of course, that is precisely what makes him worthy of it, because the sacrifice of Christ at the cross was done for sinners, of which he has just recognized that he is one. But this is all a theological training here. On a human level, we recognize that we don't deserve the communion, and that is precisely why the communion was necessary. That's what made the sacrifice so. And thereby God shows his love. And so in 1 John 1, 7 and 8, we read, "This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and gave himself as a propitiation for sin." So here love himself is showing that he is love and loving, and that we have no understanding of that outside of receiving what he gives to us as a free gift of grace. So it's a wonderful little poem. Let me conclude with another poem pulling in the same direction, but rather with different imagery, and that is of the pulley. A pulley is, of course, a means by which we can, through with a rope, pull down, and the heavy weight goes up with it. It's a mechanism by which heavy weights can be lifted. The Pulley by George Herbert. And it's presented in the form of a little tale, a little myth. There's no source for this per se. It's just a way of looking at it, I believe. The pulley. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, "Let us," said he, "pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span." So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made us stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure rest in the bottom lay. "For if I should," said he, "bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature. So both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast." I think this is a wonderful little poem. Again, reminds me of that passage in Augustine's Confessions, in which he says that, "Lord, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in thee." I'm not sure if Herbert had that in mind here, but it's entirely possible that he did. There's an aching absence in the human heart for God. It's a spiritual longing. It's a need that is filled by many means, all of which torment us in the end, which we call idolatry, things that we want to fill that God-shaped gap in ourselves, whether it's riches or whether it's power, whether it's sex, whether it's through other relationships, whether it's through the diversions of entertainment, all of which can distract us from the one thing that completes us and gives us rest, which is Jesus himself, who is our Sabbath rest. Remember that creation itself was completed in 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. And he rested as we should rest on the day of the Sabbath, and by hearing his word and the way it blesses us and gives us rest for our souls. This is what Herbert has in mind here. And he presents it in a rather delightful way in which God's creation is presented as a manifold blessing in many ways, but lacking in one thing, which is the rest that comes on the Sabbath day, which he himself gives to us when we come to him in prayer and receiving his word and receiving his blessing. So it's something that we have to do, which is to do nothing but receive what he gives us. So it's a wonderful word on which to conclude this little reflection on Herbert's poetry. I hope you found it a blessing yourself. Take care.